Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, Chapter 18. Charlotte and Emily were put together into the same bedroom, though they had expected to be separated. Still better, they were also put into Oak Tree, the largest room in the school. It had 8 beds, and one of them was Bunty's. Bunty was subdued since her father's death, but only by her own standards, not by anyone else's. Ruth was also there, recovered from flu. She had been at home for some time convalescing, so Charlotte had not seen her since the night she had climbed into the school. She tried to avoid her now, blushing at the thought of it, trying to imagine what Ruth might say. But Ruth rushed over to her especially. "Do you know, Claire," she cried, "do you know when I was ill I had such a funny dream. I dreamed I woke up and you were standing there, and you looked so real that it might really have been you. Wasn't that funny?" "Yes, wasn't it?" said Charlotte, blushing still more, but much relieved. The thought of Ruth having pursued her uncomfortably for weeks. It was good to go to bed that night without the picture called Mark of the German Beast glaring at her so horribly. It was good altogether to be going to bed back at the school, in the school. The lightness and joyfulness she felt made her aware of how worried she had been. Suspense and uncertainty still remained, of course, because although at school she was not in the right school bed, such a mixture of feelings made it hard for her to sleep that night. Elsie Brand slept in the same room. The ending of the war seemed to have lessened no one's dislike of her. Perhaps her being half German had been, after all, merely an excuse. Certainly she was the hardest person to like that Charlotte had ever met, though she had tried her best. One trouble was that Elsie never seemed to notice any difference between friendliness and enmity, responding to neither. Much of the time she was ignored, but sometimes the others teased her, jointly or singly. 2 nights after Charlotte and Emily came back to school, Elsie had only just slipped the ribbon and barrette from her long braid, when Bunty, rather excited for some reason, snatched both from her, threw them onto the glass roof outside their room. This roof, over a big veranda, sloped downward, but under their window and along the wall its top was flat and about 3 feet wide. Bunty and the others had often boasted they could walk on it, but it did not look particularly strong, and no one much wanted to plunge through to the stone floor beneath. So no one till now had done much more than talk. Elsie stared at the window for a moment woodenly. Then she slowly moved over and leaned out of it, looking for her ribbon, which the weight of the beret had taken far beyond arm's reach. "Why don't you go out and get it, Elsie?" "She wouldn't. She couldn't. All Germans are cowards, didn't you know?" Charlotte said indignantly. "Of course Elsie isn't a coward. How can you all be so beastly?" Elsie said nothing. She stared on, dumbly, helplessly at her ribbon. "Well, she is a coward unless she goes out and gets her ribbon. It's her ribbon, after all." "Cowardy, cowardy custard," shouted Emily. "Cowardy, cowardy custard." She seemed to be taking her mood from Bunty, was very loud and overexcited. "Cowardy, cowardy custard," she cried, making Charlotte at once extremely angry. She too cried out, "Elsie isn't a coward. She isn't. You'll do it, won't you, Elsie? Walk out there, and I'll come with you to keep you company." Somehow, after a scramble, they were both on the glass roof. Charlotte ahead, Elsie following, dazed, looking as if she had been floated out on Charlotte's rage and did not know where she was, let alone why she should be there. Charlotte was still angry, beginning to be frightened, but curiously exhilarated. Looking down through the blurred tinted glass was like looking down into the sea. The shapes of heaped old chairs and tennis nets might have been rocks or weeds or fish. The air felt cold as water from her face. When she turned her head, she saw that Elsie was quite white now, her face curiously flat-looking, edgeless even. Charlotte began to urge her along to help to calm her own rising fear. The fury that had gotten her out onto the roof still made her forget to be frightened, as she would normally have been. "Come on, Elsie, look, it's all right. The glass is quite strong. It must be, or it would have cracked by now." The glass looked like ice, but felt much smoother to walk upon, less cold, though icy enough to bare feet, which grew to a point of ache when left more than a minute in one place. Sometimes her feet met the thin raised hump of the leaden joints, which felt more impressive to feet. Then they looked to eyes. Hands scraped along warmer, rougher brick, ahead where the roof began to slope. The ribbon blew about a little on the glass. Charlotte, leaving, bent to pick it up, very slowly and gingerly, but even so, as she pulled herself up again, she swayed briefly, grabbed at air, the breath lurching from her till her hands returned to the comfort of the brick. For a moment she stood to regain her calm. Then she gave the ribbon to Elsie, and they both began edging carefully back the way they had come, left hands on the wall now instead of right. In front of them, the heads of Ruth and Bunty poked from the window anxiously. Immediately before Charlotte's eyes, Elsie's untied braid unraveled a little and blew toward her in the wind. So near safety, Charlotte was at last quite terrified. "Elsie, are you all right?" she asked with a small shake in her voice, which she could not prevent. "You'll have to get in first. I'll wait." Elsie said nothing. She scarcely moved herself, but was heaved by the others over the sill, her feet tilting, her skirts tumbling up. Then it was Charlotte's turn. She gave her hands to Ruth and Emily and pushed with her feet. To her relief, she must have pushed too hard because the glass immediately exploded beneath her, her head jerking round at once. She had the impression of seeing it crack, the crack spreading out as if someone invisible drew a line across. Then she too tumbled forward into the room, away from the glass. But the soles of her feet remained for several minutes afterwards, as cold as if still clamped to it. Charlotte was very contrite afterwards, her anger gone. She had been well scolded for an action so stupid and dangerous, and how well aware how dangerous it had been, and was well aware of how dangerous it had been. "Honestly, I'm sorry, Elsie," she said, "making you do something so silly. It was very silly of me. I don't know what came over me, honestly. Well, we got your ribbon back anyway." "It didn't matter. I had another ribbon," Elsie said. Her taciturnity did not appear dented in the least. Emily said to Charlotte, "Claire wouldn't have done that. Wouldn't she? Wouldn't she really? She'd have stood up for Elsie. She might have gotten very angry, but she wouldn't have done anything suddenly like that. Claire doesn't do things suddenly. Sometimes I get awfully cross with her for being so cautious. It's not that she isn't brave, of course," Emily added in a rush. "She's fearfully brave." There was silence briefly. Then she said even faster, so fast that Charlotte only caught what she said. "I'll miss you. Honestly, I will, though I want Claire back." "Will you?" Charlotte blushed with pleasure and delight. "Will you really, Emily? But I'll miss you too. Of course you'd rather have Emma than me, wouldn't you? Because she's your sister." "Yes, she is my sister," said Charlotte cautiously. It would be lying to say she would not take Emma if she had to choose. But she had grown extremely fond of Emily, besides not wanting to hurt her. "Well, Claire's my sister, isn't she? But I think I might miss you all the same," said Emily in her funny, abrupt manner, and giggled off. As it did not matter what she said, she reminded Charlotte suddenly and painfully of her own sister Emma. If Miss Bite had intended at first to show extra strictness to Charlotte and Emily, and even more so when the roof was broken, this turned out to be impossible. Not only more and more girls, but more and more teachers were going down with flu, and the remaining teachers spent much of their time in the sick room helping Nurse Gregory. The sick rooms were crammed, and there seemed little hope immediately of Charlotte's departure. But once in the school, she was prepared to wait a while. So apparently was Emily. Charlotte was surprised by her own patience. She thought it must be because now, within reach of her own time, she felt apprehensive about returning to it. So much would have happened she would be expected to know about, but would not know. There was no one to help her in that time as Emily helped her here. Also, she was so used to trying to behave like Claire that she could scarcely remember what it was like to behave like Charlotte. She scarcely seemed to know who Charlotte was. What Emily had said after she had fetched Ethel's ribbon from the What Emily had said after she had fetched Elsie's ribbon from the glass roof had encouraged her only for a little while. This was altogether a strange, separate time. The fog had closed down outside, making a little box of time all on its own. Even more than usual, the school was a little box-like, separate place, with its own pleasures and concerns. No grass, no trees, no streets, no traffic to be seen beyond its walls, only the yellow flannelish wall of fog. School became like a game, a picnic, because of the fog, the ending of the war, the flu. Lessons were improvised in the day. They did more dancing than history or arithmetic, the dancing mistress being well, the others ill. In the evenings, they were able to play wild games, piling all the mattresses on the floor of their bedrooms and jumping from the tall white cupboards, playing leapfrog, backs bent the length of the long room, playing sardines and murder in the dark, bodies squashed into the big white cupboards unseen, but creepy, suffocatingly heavy and warm. No one came near to find them out, except one night when the murder victim screamed too loudly, too realistically, and brought Nurse Gregory running in. Charlotte, for this little while, was happier than she had ever been in Claire's time. Warm and contented, she almost wished it would go on forever, that nothing would change at all. When the chance did come for her to return to her own time, if it ever did, she was afraid she might have been gone too long, and that if she did sleep in the bed with the little wheels, the magic would not work again. Perhaps it was the same contentment and the same fear that made Emily patient too, but Emily did not say. The chance arrived at last, so calmly and easily that it seemed odd it had never come before. Emily caught the flu and went to bed. After 3 days, a note was smuggled from a sick room by someone just recovered. It was written on a piece of exercise book paper, rubbed and grubby and folded so minutely that it took Charlotte a frustratingly long time to unfold. "I'm in the room," it said, "next to the bed. It will be empty tonight, if no one else gets flu. Better come tonight. Love, Emily." All the rest of the day, despite excitement and pleasure, Charlotte was filled with a kind of huge nostalgia. That night happened to be her bath night, and she lay in the bath, in the miserly inches of lukewarm water that was all they allowed, listening to gas lights fizzle on the wall, holding in her hands a brown translucent cake of soap that smelled glum and parsimonious. She was trying to glue it all into her mind, how the past looked and sounded, at its wartime bleakest, at its best. This room, partitioned in her own time into a row of narrow bathrooms, was still one big room with a row of baths, each with a curtain round it. Behind the next curtain she could hear Bunty splashing and singing, even Nurse Gregory's voice, sharp as glass, telling them to hurry and dry themselves. Even that seemed something to cling to and regret. In bed, Charlotte put hairbrushes on her pillow, one on each side of her head, to stop herself falling asleep. She did sleep once, but rolling over, grazed her cheek on the prickles of the brush and awoke, startled, but half dreaming still, imagining a hedgehog in her bed. There was a little gleam of light through the glass panel above the door. When her eyes had grown used to the darkness, Charlotte could see enough by this to climb out of bed, put on her dressing gown, and creep out of the room without knocking into anything. The passages were as long and empty as they had been before, the light as dim. The strip of matting down the center felt unfriendly to her bare feet, yet Charlotte only vaguely noted it, for, creeping along, she began to realize properly that she would never see anyone again, Bunty or Ruth or even Elsie, unless, of course, she saw them grown up. She heard Nurse Gregory's footsteps once, and the clatter of her starched clothes, more sounds she would never hear again. If the bed were empty, if the magic worked. Inside the sick room, she thought for a horrid moment that the bed was not empty, that someone was lying there, but it proved only a rounded shadow after all. The bed awaited her, and so did Emily, still wide awake. "I thought you were never coming," she whispered accusingly as Charlotte groped her way across the room, stubbing her feet painfully on the iron wheels of the bed, which was nearer than she judged. "I went to sleep by mistake. I had hairbrushes by my head, though, and they woke me up all right." "Thank goodness for that," said Emily in a heartfelt voice that hurt Charlotte a little, although she had felt the same herself. "Other people have slept in your bed," Emily went on, "and they're always just the same in the morning, so it must be something special to do with you and Claire. Unless the bed doesn't work anymore," Charlotte thought. But she did not say it. She asked instead, "Are you better, Emily? How's your flu?" "Oh, yes, they say I'll get up soon. I haven't had it badly at all. I'm glad. I'm sick of this bed and Gregory's horrid powders, whatever they are, and medicines." After a long pause, Emily added, Aren't you ever going to get into bed?" "Oh, yes, of course," said Charlotte, who had been standing in a strange agitation and was still so agitated that she climbed into bed wearing Claire's dressing gown. "If you shout like that," Emily was whispering severely meanwhile, "you'll wake everyone up, then Nurse Gregory will come, and then where will you be?" But no one in the other beds had stirred it all. Emily and Charlotte lay in silence for a long time. Charlotte felt so wide awake that she wondered if she would ever fall asleep. What would happen if she stayed awake all night and did not sleep? Could it happen then? She almost believed that nothing would happen in any case. Her own time seemed so remote and unlikely now, and it was belatedly that she remembered she must say goodbye to Emily. But Emily's breath was even, slow. She was fast asleep. Charlotte wanted to wake her, to say goodbye, but it seemed unkind. In a rush of difficult, muddled feelings, she began to cry, stupidly, sadly, burying her head in the increasingly sodden pillow, and wondering if she cried, what would happen if Nurse Gregory came in the night to find her in this bed. Then, unexpectedly, she too fell fast asleep. And that is the end of chapter 18.